What would you do if the most powerful woman in your world performed rituals so terrifying that no one dared to even whisper her name after sunset? That question haunted every soul in her kingdom, because the queen who ruled in the shadows was not feared for her armies or her throne, but for what she did when the night smothered the last trace of light. Her reign looked glorious from the outside, a dynasty built on victories, alliances, and a reputation for unshakable authority. But behind closed doors, behind the silk curtains and carved stone corridors, an entirely different kingdom existed, one shaped by secret nighttime ceremonies that only a chosen few ever saw, and none survived unchanged. The deeper you looked, the clearer it became that her real power did not come from politics, but from rites that twisted the boundary between superstition and something far more dangerous. Servants whispered of footsteps echoing in abandoned halls long after the guards had retired. Advisors claimed to hear low chants rising through the walls, the kind that made their skin tighten and their breath falter without knowing why. Some nights, the queen's shadow stretched unnaturally across the torchlit floors, moving just slightly out of rhythm with her body. Stories like these were never recorded in official court chronicles, but they lived in the terrified glances exchanged by those who served her. And the most unsettling part was not the rituals themselves, but the silence surrounding them. People vanished after asking the wrong questions. Witnesses to her haunting ceremonies were reassigned to remote outposts, sent to monasteries, or found lifeless with expressions frozen in a kind of horror that no battlefield could produce. Even the elite guard assigned to protect her refused to patrol near the West Wing after midnight. They spoke of strange markings appearing on the queen's chamber door, symbols that flickered like embers even when untouched by fire. No one knew their meaning, but everyone understood one unspoken truth. The queen was not alone during those ceremonies. Whether she summoned ancient forces, communed with forgotten deities, or simply believed fully in the rituals she performed, something answered her. Something that granted her the authority no rival ever managed to challenge. Every victory she won, every rebellion crushed before it began, every ally who bent the knee without negotiation seemed to trace back to the nights she spent, performing rites that blurred faith, fear, and forbidden knowledge. What kept people awake was the suspicion that her power demanded a price. Animals recoiled when she passed. Children cried uncontrollably in her presence. Even the air around her felt heavier, charged with secrets no one dared unravel. And yet, the more these rumors spread, the stronger her authority grew. Because fear, once rooted in the spine of a kingdom, becomes the most efficient weapon a ruler can wield. And still, no one knew what she truly did once the torches dimmed and the palace walls held their breath. But you are about to, and what comes next may change the way you understand the boundaries of power. Before we go deeper, share your thoughts. What do you think lies behind rituals that shape a kingdom's fate? And have you ever encountered a story that unsettled you this much? Leave a comment with your reaction. Make sure to like this video to help others uncover these hidden truths, and check if you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because the next layer of this story pulls you even further into the darkness she created. As night after night, her secret ceremonies grew more dangerous and more indispensable to her rule. The origins of her power were not written in royal archives, yet they lingered in the fractures of ancient stories spoken only by those old enough to remember the kingdom before her rise. Long before she ascended the throne, the land had been torn apart by famine, rival clans, and a spiritual void that left people desperate for signs, omens, anything that suggested the gods had not abandoned them. In that desperation, myths resurfaced, tales of women who once stood between the mortal world and forces unseen, women who drew strength not through bloodlines, but through rituals performed in secrecy, guided by symbols older than the kingdom itself. It was said the queen had been trained by one of the last keepers of those forbidden traditions, a woman who, lived on the outskirts of civilization, shunned for her knowledge, yet sought by those who needed answers no priest could provide. Whispers claim that as a child, the queen survived an illness that should have taken her life, and when she recovered, her temperament had shifted in ways that unsettled her caretakers. She spoke of dreams filled with figures cloaked in ash, of voices instructing her to remember signs no one had taught her, and of a presence that lingered beside her bed at night, observing rather than comforting. Her father dismissed these stories as imagination, but the elders grew frightened. Some insisted she had been chosen for something, though no one could agree whether that was a blessing or a curse. What no one realized then was that these early dreams would become the blueprint of the ceremonies she later performed as queen, rituals refined through years of experimentation, loss, and unrelenting ambition. As she grew, so did her fascination with power that extended beyond politics. While other heirs studied diplomacy, she memorized ancient tablets, learned forgotten dialects, and sought artifacts buried beneath abandoned temples. She asked questions that no future monarch should ask, questions about the limits of mortality, the cost of influence, and the possibility of harnessing forces that once shaped entire civilizations. By the time she inherited the throne, she possessed not just the knowledge of her predecessors, but an understanding of the dark spiritual machinery that could be turned to her advantage. Those who opposed her ascension found their factions weakening without explanation. Natural disasters struck regions where her rivals lived. Key figures fell ill with symptoms no healer recognized. The public believed it was fate. Those closest to the court suspected otherwise. In those early years, her nighttime ceremonies were still unrefined, more exploratory than commanding. But each ritual taught her something. She learned which symbols demanded silence, which words unlocked the sense of a presence near her, and which offerings triggered subtle shifts in the physical world. Servants overheard her muttering phrases in languages lost to time, and ministers noticed she emerged from her chamber with an aura that made them instinctively lower their eyes. Everything about her suggested she was preparing for something greater, a culmination of energies she believed would secure her reign permanently. The kingdom did not, yet realized that the true transformation had only just begun, and that her rituals were evolving into something far more calculated and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Those who served closest to her learned quickly that survival depended not on loyalty, but on silence. The palace, once a bustling monument to royal prestige, grew unnervingly quiet in her presence. Conversations that once echoed through marble halls were reduced to whispers barely audible over the sound of crackling torches. Servants avoided crossing her path after dusk, claiming the temperature dropped each time she approached, as if the air itself braced for something unseen. Guards who had once been celebrated for bravery now exchanged tense glances, refusing assignments near the western corridors where her chamber door bore those shifting symbols no one dared touch. They said the markings glowed faintly only on nights she performed her secret rites, and that a trembling energy pulsed under the stone floor when her chanting began. Rumors spread of servants who accidentally glimpsed something they should not have. A maid who delivered linens too late one night vanished before dawn. A stable boy who overheard a strange voice coming from the queen's room was found mile downstream, his expression twisted in terror despite no signs of injury. Official reports claimed these incidents were accidents, unfortunate missteps, but the palace staff knew better. They exchanged stories behind storage rooms and inside the kitchens where heavy pots masked their voices. Some insisted they heard footsteps in empty corridors. Others claimed the queen's shadow moved independently from her body when the moonlight hit a certain way, and a few confessed they had begun dreaming of her ceremonies without ever witnessing them. Her advisors fared no better. These were seasoned men, scholars, strategists, individuals who had weathered decades of war and political upheaval without fear. But in meetings with her, their confidence fractured. She would pause mid-conversation to tilt her head as if listening to someone unseen. At times, she responded to questions no one had asked. A few advisors swore they heard faint whispers, like a second voice layered beneath her own. But whenever they tried to focus on the sound, it dissolved into silence. One minister, a respected historian, resigned without explanation after a private audience with her. He left the palace pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what he had witnessed. Months later, he was found burned, clutching a scrap of parchment bearing the same symbol carved on her chamber door. There were other moments, too subtle to report, but too disturbing to forget. Candles near her flickered violently despite the absence of wind. Pets avoided the throne room entirely, growling at corners where nothing visible stood. On several occasions, guards claimed that when they bowed, they felt a heaviness press against their backs, as if multiple eyes watched them rather than just the queen's. Even ambassadors from distant nations left the court unsettled, unable to explain why their negotiations dissolved into confusion the longer they remained in her presence. They returned home describing her not as a ruler, but as a force that stood behind the throne, manipulating everything with an invisible hand. Despite all of this, no one dared challenge her. The memory of those who tried only reinforced the fear. A counselor, who questioned her authority, publicly died that same night during a feast, his body collapsing without a mark. His peers remained silent, pretending not to notice the faint smile that curved on her lips as the room descended into panic. The court understood then that there were rules no one had the authority to name, boundaries shaped not by law, but by whatever power she summoned during those secret ceremonies. And as the nights grew longer, the kingdom would soon learn that the strange events haunting the palace were only the beginning of something far more consuming. The ceremonies she performed did not begin with spectacle, but with a stillness so profound that those who unknowingly passed nearby felt it in their bones before hearing a single sound. It always started after the last torch in the palace corridors dimmed, when the moon was hidden behind clouds and the air felt heavier than it should. Inside her private chamber, she would extinguish every flame, plunging the room into a darkness so complete that even the carvings on the walls vanished from sight. Servants who cleaned the space during daylight once described a strange metallic scent lingering on certain nights, a scent that no amount of scrubbing seemed able to remove. Yet the true transformation began when she opened a small wooden coffer carved with symbols older than the kingdom itself, a relic said to have been passed down through generations of forbidden practitioners. From this coffer, she removed objects whose purposes no one could fully decipher. Some were made of bone, others of polished stone etched with patterns too intricate for any craftsman of her era. She arranged them in a circle, always in the same order, always with a precision that suggested the slightest mistake could unleash consequences beyond her control. Then came the chanting, low at first, barely a vibration, yet capable of unsettling anyone who heard even a fragment of it. The sound did not resemble prayer or incantation, but something between a lament and a call, as if she were summoning a presence that hovered just beyond the threshold of the visible world. Those who lived in chambers directly beneath hers reported waking with sudden panic, their dreams filled with distorted versions of the queen's voice, echoing from places that did not exist. The rituals grew stranger as the years passed. Witnesses described seeing faint glows beneath her doorway, pulsing in a rhythm that matched no natural source of light. Others spoke of shadows gathering along the corridor, shadows that seemed to watch rather than wander, dispersing only when footsteps approached. On one occasion, a guard swore he saw the queen herself standing outside her room, only to realize she was still within it, when a second silhouette moved across the candlelit slit under her door. Terrified, he requested reassignment the next morning, claiming he could not stand watch near a place where the boundary between body and, spirit no longer held firm. Despite the fear, curiosity grew among a few members of the court. Some wondered whether her rituals were merely psychological displays designed to maintain authority. But those who attempted to investigate found themselves inexplicably drawn into her orbit. One young scholar who studied ancient rites claimed he heard whispers guiding him toward the queen's chamber during one of her ceremonies. He followed them, entranced, only to collapse several steps from her door, with blood dripping from his nose and his memory fractured. The next day, he could recall nothing except a single phrase repeating in his mind, a phrase in a language he had never learned. Whatever she summoned during those midnight hours was not content to remain confined to her circle of objects and symbols. It reached outward, probing the minds of those too close, pulling them toward something they could not comprehend. As each ritual intensified, so did its effects on the palace atmosphere. Mirrors fogged without moisture. Lamps extinguished themselves. Pets hid under furniture, trembling violently. And though no one dared confront her, everyone felt the same truth. The queen was no longer merely performing ceremonies. She was merging with them, becoming something shaped by the very forces she called upon. And this transformation was only beginning to reveal itself, unraveling threads of reality that left even the bravest members of the court questioning how much longer the kingdom could withstand the darkness growing within its walls. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think these ceremonies were truly awakening, and what part of this story unsettles you the most? Your insight might reveal patterns others have missed as the next pieces of this tale come to light. The deeper her ceremonies evolved, the more they demanded from her, as if each ritual required a greater offering than the last. At first, the sacrifices were symbolic, small tokens drawn from tradition, grains, herbs, fragments of carved stone believed to hold ancestral meaning. But these gestures soon proved insufficient for whatever force she sought to invoke. Observers noticed subtle changes in her appearance after each ceremony. Her eyes darkened around the edges, as though shadows clung to her skin even under bright daylight. Her voice carried a resonance that seemed slightly out of sync with the natural acoustics of the room, as if another tone echoed beneath her words. And at times, when she passed through the palace, tapestries fluttered without wind, reacting more to her presence than to the environment itself. The shift became undeniable when offerings of inanimate objects no longer produced the outcomes she desired. Animals began disappearing from the palace grounds, first small ones like birds and rodents, then gradually larger livestock from the royal farms. Rumors circulated among the staff that the queen had been seen carrying a bowl filled with dark liquid into her chamber on nights when the chanting grew louder. No one dared investigate, but the meaning was clear. The rituals had crossed into the realm of blood. Those attuned to such practices whispered that sacrifice was not merely symbolic in ancient rites, but a mechanism for binding energy, channeling influence, and forging alliances with the unseen. Whether she believed in these ancient laws or manipulated them for political advantage, the results were undeniable. Her decisions became sharper, her strategies more ruthless, her intuition almost unnervingly precise. Political rivals fell one by one, undone not by armies, but by forces no strategist could predict. Plague struck regions governed by dissenting nobles, while unexpected storms destroyed supplies of those who plotted rebellion. Diplomats found themselves confused, swayed, or intimidated after mere moments in her presence, as if an invisible hand guided their emotions. Some insisted she had developed a heightened ability to read fear, desire, and intention, allowing her to exploit weaknesses instantaneously. Others believed she had transcended human perception entirely, using the rituals as a channel to something far older and more calculating. Whatever the truth, her dominance tightened around the kingdom, creating an atmosphere where obedience became instinctive rather than enforced. Yet even the queen could not hide the toll the rites took on her. On particularly In tense nights, servants claimed they heard something like a scream echo through the chamber walls, followed by a sudden stillness that made time feel suspended. The next morning, the queen would emerge pale and trembling, but with an expression of triumph that unsettled everyone who saw it. It was as if she had survived a battle no one else could witness, a confrontation that left her stronger while eroding some invisible part of her humanity. Over time, the ceremonies began to shape not only her reign but the entire kingdom. Crops withered inexplicably, animals avoided certain areas of the palace grounds, and children spoke of nightmares filled with symbols they should not have known. Despite the warnings nature seemed to send, she pressed forward, convinced that each sacrifice brought her closer to the ultimate purpose of the rites. What that purpose was, no one could say. Some believed she sought eternal rule, others claimed she was attempting to summon a lost ancestor, while a few whispered the darkest possibility, that she sought to merge fully with the presence she had been calling into her chamber since the beginning. And with every ritual pulling her deeper into the shadows, the boundaries between her desires, her fears, and the forces she invoked grew thinner, setting the stage for the next and most dangerous phase of her transformation. Nights without a moon became the most feared, for it was during these intervals of complete darkness that her rituals reached their most volatile form. The court had long noticed the pattern. When the sky offered no natural light, the palace seemed to exhale a heavy dread that settled into every stone, every tapestry, every breath drawn by those trapped within its walls. On such nights, no amount of candlelight could dispel the oppressive gloom that pressed inward from the corridors, and even the guards refused to stand watch alone. It was as if the absence of the moon removed the last barrier between the queen and whatever force she was summoning, allowing her ceremonies to unfold without restraint. Villagers living near the palace claimed they heard low rumblings rising from the ground during these moonless nights, vibrations so subtle they felt more like a shift in air pressure than sound. Meanwhile, the palace windows flickered with lights that moved in strange, irregular patterns, refusing to obey the logic of fire. Some nights, a glow would flare in the queen's chamber, only to vanish instantly, replaced by a darkness so absolute that the stars themselves seemed swallowed. Those brave enough to look toward the palace during these events swore they saw silhouettes forming behind the highest windows, shapes too large or too distorted to be human. Inside the palace, the effects of these moonless ceremonies grew increasingly difficult to ignore. Doors jammed without explanation, as if an unseen force braced itself against them. Servants attempting to flee felt themselves overcome by sudden waves of nausea or dread moments before reaching the exit. In one instance, a young attendant collapsed after glimpsing a brief, blinding flash beneath the queen's door, and when he was revived hours later, he could describe only a sensation of being watched by something with far too many eyes. The palace physicians diagnosed him with exhaustion, but the staff whispered that he had seen the true face of the ritual, a glimpse of the presence she was inviting into her world. These disturbances extended far beyond the palace. Livestock across the region became restless, refusing to sleep or eat on moonless nights. Wells ran low despite recent rains. Dogs howled relentlessly until their voices gave out. Even the wind behaved strangely, blowing in one direction only to abruptly reverse itself, as if the atmosphere were fighting against something unseen. Farmers and merchants began carrying talismans and protective charms when traveling near the capital, convinced that the queen had awakened an ancient force that sought more than her offerings. And with each cycle of the moon, the land grew heavier, as though absorbing the weight of her escalating ceremonies. What troubled the court most was the gradual shift in her demeanor during these nights. She moved differently, with an unnatural grace, as if guided by rhythms no one else could hear. Her eyes reflected light in unfamiliar ways, catching the glow of torches but refracting it like shards of dark glass. Advisors. Reported moments when she seemed not entirely present, her attention pulled elsewhere by something only she could perceive. And though she never acknowledged the rituals openly, her decisions after each moonless night grew sharper, more decisive, almost preternaturally aligned with future events. By this point, even those who once supported her reign whispered warnings behind locked doors. The kingdom, once bound by alliances and laws, was increasingly governed by fear of what her rituals might unleash. Some believed she had become a conduit for forces that could not be controlled. Others feared she was slowly losing herself, yielding piece by piece to something that viewed the world not as a kingdom, but as a domain to claim. And yet, the darkest chapter was still approaching, carried on the breath of a single witness who survived long enough to reveal what truly happened behind the sealed door of the Queen's chamber when the moon abandoned the sky. The only person who ever survived, long enough to speak of what happened inside the Queen's chamber, was a young servant named Lyra, a girl barely 16 who had been assigned to clean the outer hallway during a night when the moon had disappeared completely. No one knew why she chose to linger near the forbidden door, whether it was curiosity, fear, or some invisible pull that guided her steps. But as she later whispered through trembling lips, something about the air changed in a way she could not explain. It thickened, tightening around her lungs as if urging her closer instead of pushing her away. She claimed she heard a faint humming at first, a sound too low to be chanting yet too intentional to be random. And before she could stop herself, her hand drifted toward the Queen's door. The moment her fingers touched the wood, a shock shivered up her arm. The symbols carved into the surface pulsed faintly beneath her skin, warm like living flesh. She pulled back, horrified, but the humming inside the chamber rose sharply, shifting into a layered resonance that seemed to speak directly into her mind. Lyra later insisted that the sound did not come from the Queen alone. There were multiple voices, overlapping, moving in patterns that made her dizzy. Some whispered in her ear, others echoed behind her even though the hallway was empty. At one point she dropped to her knees, unable to stand as the weight of the sound pressed against her skull. But the true horror came when the door cracked open on its own. Just a sliver, barely wide enough to reveal anything, yet more than enough to scar her memory forever. Through that narrow gap, she saw the Queen standing in the center of the ritual circle, her body rigid, her arms lifted as though suspended by strings. The objects arranged around her glowed faintly, but the light did not illuminate her face. Instead, it cast a shadow behind her that did not match the shape of a human body. Lyra swore that the Queen was not alone in the chamber, though she saw no second figure. She described an outline, a distortion in the air like heat rising off stone, shifting and stretching around the Queen as though something was wrapping itself around her form. Lyra's vision blurred as she watched, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might burst. She tried to crawl away, but her limbs refused to obey. She claimed she felt something watching her, not from the doorway, but from within her own mind, probing her thoughts with cold precision. Then came the whisper. A single word, spoken directly into her ear, though no one stood beside her. She never repeated the word itself, only describing the feeling it left behind. A sensation of falling into a void that had no bottom. At that moment, the Queen lowered her arms, and the shadow behind her twisted sharply as if turning toward the hallway. Lyra felt a searing pressure in her skull, and then everything went black. She awoke 3 days later in a remote storeroom far from the palace chambers, her memories fragmented, but her terror intact. The royal council forbade anyone from questioning her, claiming she had simply collapsed from exhaustion. Yet her hair had turned streaks of pale gray overnight, and her voice trembled permanently, unable to hold steady even when speaking simple words. Some believed the Queen spared her as a warning, others believed whatever force she encountered chose not to claim her completely. Either way, Lyra never stepped foot near the West Wing again. And Her fragmented recollections became the only surviving testimony of what took place during those forbidden ceremonies. Tell me in the comments what you believe Lyra truly saw that night, and why such a presence would allow her to live. Your interpretation may uncover meanings hidden beneath her fractured memories. What Lyra witnessed marked a turning point for the entire kingdom, though few understood it at the time. The queen's rituals, once whispered about only in secret corridors, now manifested consequences that reached far beyond the palace walls. In the weeks that followed Lyra's collapse, the atmosphere of the realm shifted in ways that scholars and elders could not explain. Storms formed without warning, striking regions that had been dry for months. Crops that had flourished suddenly wilted overnight, their leaves curled as though touched by an invisible fire. Travelers reported seeing strange patterns in the sky during moonless hours, lines of light that twisted in unnatural arcs before dissolving into darkness. Even the most devout priests admitted quietly that they sensed a disturbance, a fracture in the balance that once governed the land. Inside the court, the queen's behavior became increasingly erratic. She isolated herself for days, emerging only to issue new decrees that no advisor dared question. Her eyes seemed different, darker around the edges, as if shadow had seeped into the very structure of her gaze. Conversations with her grew, unpredictable. One moment she spoke with clarity, the next she paused mid-sentence as though listening to an unseen voice. Some advisors noticed that her reflection in mirrors appeared slightly delayed, not perfectly syncing with her movements. Others insisted they heard soft clicking sounds when she inhaled, as though a second breath layered itself beneath her own. These observations spread quietly among the court, creating a growing dread that whatever shared the chamber with her during the rituals had not left after the ceremonies ended. More troubling still were the events that unfolded during diplomatic gatherings. Delegates from neighboring kingdoms arrived to negotiate trade agreements or peace terms, only to leave visibly shaken. They described feeling as though the walls themselves were closing around them, or as though their thoughts were being nudged into unfamiliar directions. One ambassador claimed that, while speaking with the queen, he momentarily forgot his own name, recalling it only after stumbling backward from her presence. These incidents, though never publicly acknowledged, weakened alliances and fueled fears that the queen's power had expanded beyond the political realm into something far more insidious. Meanwhile, the land began responding in unsettling ways. Animals behaved unpredictably, gathering in clusters as though preparing for an unseen threat. Rivers developed sudden currents, pulling objects upstream against the natural flow. Trees leaned at unnatural angles, their branches twisting toward the palace as though reaching for something. Elders in remote villages spoke of old prophecies, tales of rulers who invited forces beyond mortal comprehension and inadvertently shattered the foundation of their realms. These warnings traveled slowly, carried through rumor and whispered prayer, but each retelling intensified the fear gripping the kingdom. Even the palace archives began showing signs of disturbance. Ink faded from pages, overnight, leaving blank scrolls where royal records once existed. Maps warped, their borders shifting subtly as though the land itself were rewriting its shape. When scholars attempted to rewrite the lost information, their hands trembled uncontrollably, and they often abandoned their work in tears, unable to shake the feeling that they were being watched by an entity that lingered just beyond their field of vision. All of this pointed to one truth, whispered in the deepest corners of the palace. The queen's final ritual, the one she had been preparing for years, was approaching. Those who sensed the shift knew it would not be a ceremony of mere influence or protection. It would be something catastrophic, an invocation powerful enough to alter the fate of the kingdom itself. And though the palace continued to operate under the guise of normalcy, the tremors running beneath its foundations told a different story. The realm was bracing for an event it neither understood nor had the strength to resist. The queen's unraveling did not happen suddenly. It unfolded quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the spaces between her rituals, in the hollow pauses that began appearing during her councils, in the vacant way her eyes lingered on people as if she were assessing something deeper than their words. Those closest to her noticed the deterioration first. She became increasingly detached from her surroundings, drifting through the palace like a presence more than a person. Her steps no longer echoed with the confident cadence of a monarch, but with a strange softness, as though her feet barely touched the ground. Servants claimed they sometimes saw her standing motionless for long stretches, her gaze fixed on corners where no light reached, as if waiting for a response from something that only she could see. Stranger still was the way the palace itself seemed to react to her. Tapestries fluttered whenever she passed, even when there was no breeze. Floors creaked under, the weight of footsteps that were not her own, trailing behind her like a procession of unseen figures. Doors swung open moments before she approached them, and candles dimmed when she entered a room, only to flare violently as she left. Some swore the air grew colder in her presence, while others described a faint vibration beneath their feet, as if the stones themselves were shifting in response to her movements. These unsettling details, though rarely spoken aloud, convinced many that the Queen was no longer acting alone. She had become a vessel for something that influenced her decisions, her emotions, even her memories. Her political strategies, once measured and decisive, began to fractalize into unpredictable patterns. Alliances formed abruptly only to dissolve without explanation. Regions she once protected were abandoned to famine or revolt, while insignificant territories suddenly received favor and resources. Advisors found themselves unable to predict her reasoning, and several resigned in fear after witnessing her speak in a language unknown to any scholar. These episodes were brief, but long enough to imprint dread on those who heard the sharp, rhythmic syllables that resonated from her throat. Some described the language as sounding older than stone, others as something unnatural, like the echo of a voice that struggled to remember what humanity once felt like. Attempts to challenge her control over the kingdom were short-lived. Rebellions sparked quietly, in remote provinces, only to crumble as their leaders succumbed to sudden illness or vanished without a trace. In at least one case, an entire council of dissenters reportedly fell into madness, each member found muttering the same incomprehensible phrase moments before clawing at their own skin in terror. The palace refused to release official reports, but fragments of the events leaked through terrified whispers. Even those who were loyal began to question whether the Queen herself orchestrated these horrors, or whether the force that had taken root within her was acting of its own accord. Meanwhile, the sky above the capital began to behave in ways that defied logic. Clouds gathered in patterns that resembled the symbols carved on the Queen's chamber door. Lightning forked silently through the night, illuminating the palace in stark flashes that revealed shifting shapes along its highest towers. Birds migrated out of season, fleeing the capital as though sensing an approaching cataclysm. And on the eve of the event that would later be known only as the Silent Night, the moon turned a dull, ashen gray, its light barely reaching the earth, casting the kingdom into a muted twilight that stretched long after dusk. Historians would later debate whether the Queen understood the magnitude of what she was awakening, or whether she had long since lost the ability to distinguish her own will from the presence guiding her. What mattered to those who lived through it was the same unspoken truth that haunted every whispered conversation. Something had shifted too far to be undone. Whatever final ritual she had been preparing for was imminent, and the land itself recoiled in anticipation, sensing that the culmination of her ceremonies would not merely threaten the throne, but unravel the very fabric of the world they knew. The night of the final ritual began with an unsettling stillness that clung to the kingdom like a shroud. Hours before darkness settled, birds abandoned the palace grounds, livestock hid in cramped spaces, and winds that had howled for days suddenly fell silent. It was as if the entire realm sensed the culmination of everything the queen had been weaving through her ceremonies. Within the palace, those who served closest to her felt the shift most acutely. They described a metallic taste in the air, a heaviness that pressed against their chests, making each breath feel like a negotiation rather than an instinct. Even the bravest guards hesitated to enter the western corridors, where the stones themselves vibrated with a faint rhythmic pulse, as though echoing a heartbeat not human. When the queen entered her chamber, witnesses said the walls trembled slightly, as if acknowledging her arrival. The objects she had used for years in her rituals were already arranged in a precise formation on the floor, but the glow that once flickered gently from them now burned with a cold, sharp intensity. She stepped into the center of the circle with the calm of someone who had crossed the threshold between fear and determination long ago. Yet something in her posture suggested she understood the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Her hands shook only once before she raised them, and as her voice began its incantation, the temperature in the room dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the edges of the stone tiles. The ritual unfolded with a violence no one expected. The symbols carved into the floor ignited in spirals of pale light, and shadows moved independently from any physical form. The queen's voice split, fracturing into multiple tones layered in impossible harmonies. Outside the chamber, guards collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads as sensations of disorientation churned through their minds. The air crackled with energy, heavy enough to warp the space around the chamber door. Some swore they saw spectral shapes flickering behind the walls, as though something ancient had awakened, inside the very structure of the palace. And then the sound shifted. It deepened, resonated, expanded, until it felt as if the entire kingdom vibrated with a single unbroken note. Just when it seemed the ritual would tear the palace apart, the energy surged inward, collapsing into a blinding point of light at the queen's feet. What happened next remains the most contested mystery in the kingdom's history. Some claimed the queen vanished in that explosion of light, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of burnt herbs. Others insisted she transformed, becoming something not entirely physical, her presence dissolving into the air like a breath exhaled by the shadows themselves. A few whispered that she still walks the palace corridors on moonless nights, her footsteps echoing just slightly out of rhythm with the living. Whatever the truth, the kingdom awoke the next morning to a silence so profound it felt sacred. The queen was gone, the symbols on her chamber floor smudged into meaningless shapes, and the oppressive weight that had lingered for years slowly lifted, though never completely. In the centuries that followed, scholars, mystics, and historians attempted to piece together the meaning of her final ceremony. Some believed she achieved precisely what she sought, retreating into a realm where power no longer required a mortal vessel. Others argued she became trapped between worlds, a cautionary tale about the dangers of invoking forces beyond comprehension. But the oldest theory, whispered only among those who still study forbidden rites, claims that the ritual never truly ended. It simply paused, waiting for someone bold or reckless enough to finish what she began. If you reach this point, tell me in the comments with the phrase "I stayed until the last shadow." It helps me understand who follows these darker histories to their final breath. And if this journey into forgotten power resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel so you can keep exploring these hidden stories alongside me. A like also supports the creation of more content like this. And if you want to continue down this path, there is another video waiting for you, one that deepens this world even further. Let curiosity guide you there as the echoes of this tale settle around you,